Welcome to Political Analytics 2, to our second, hopefully, annual meeting in a long string of annual meetings of this conference. I'm Stephen Ansalabahir. I'm a professor of government and the director of the Center for American Political Studies, which hosts this conference. And our next event is April 6th. Oscar Palacio will speak. He's a renowned photographer. We have an installation of his photography across the way in the mirror image building on the 4th floor, which is where the Center for American Political Studies is. This program is supported by Microsoft, L2, and IQSS, as well as the Center for American Political Studies. We're extremely grateful for the support that these organizations have given us, because without them, this isn't possible. And L2 also sponsored something you'll hear throughout the day, which is our first hackathon, where 4 teams competed to solve a problem. And we'll hear more about that as the day rolls on. I'm very thankful also to 3 people who did an extraordinary amount of work making all this happen, getting us organized, putting the programs together, making sure people were in place where they needed to be. Laura Donaldson, who's the manager of the Center for American Political Studies. Stephen Pettigrew, who's a graduate student in our department. And where did she go? Shannon McGregor, who's on her way to Utah as an assistant professor. And finally, big thanks to the 2 people who came up with this project and program, organized this program, and are really the energy and brain children behind this. Kirk Goldsberry, who's vice president at the San Antonio Spurs, and Ryan Enos, who's an associate professor in the Department of Government. Thank you, Ryan and Kirk, and let's get this party started.
Hey, I'm Kirk. Thanks for coming in. The New York Times has predicted it's not going to snow this afternoon, so sorry. With that, Tim, Andrei, why don't you guys take your seats? I'll make some opening remarks here. I'd like to sort of add to what Stephen was saying. Thank you guys for coming. Before we begin the program, I'd just like to spend a minute reminding you guys of our purpose here. So with the support of Stephen and our sponsors and Laura and Stephen Pettigrew and all of our great support staff, Ryan and I started this conference a couple years ago. Our vision was simple: to create a forum for interesting people to discuss emerging components of political analyses. In 2017, that means computation, prediction, stats, and visualization. So one of the reasons we started the conference was that we saw a need for a spotlight on a yearly basis to be shown on emerging trends in political discourse. And such a spotlight has never been more important than it is right now. The way we're talking and thinking about elections in the United States in 2017 is remarkably different than it was just a decade ago. Some of these changes are great, some are not. The morning after the 2016 presidential election was noteworthy for many reasons. We woke up to a different America. Many of us tuned into cable television or read the internet in stunned disbelief. For those of us that tuned into MSNBC, we saw Joe Scarborough repeatedly say, "Data is dead." Mr. Scarborough's point about the death of data had a lot to do with some predictions and some analyses that forecasted that Hillary Clinton, not Donald Trump, would become the next president. When that did not happen, many individuals looked at those prognostications with scorn. Now, I'm just a lowly sports guy. I've never worked for a fancy cable news outlet or a political campaign, but just maybe there's something that sports and sports fans can teach folks like Mr. Scarborough. Sometimes the underdogs win, sometimes Las Vegas loses, and since we last gathered here, the last sports year has had its share of unlikely victors. When the Atlanta Falcons led the New England Patriots 28-3 in the second half of the Super Bowl, their win probability was estimated to be over 99%. When the Golden State Warriors led the Cleveland Cavaliers 3-1 in the 2016 NBA Finals, their win probability was estimated to be over 95%. And when the Cleveland Indians led the Chicago Cubs in the 2016 World Series 3-1, their win probability was also estimated to be over 90%. but sometimes unlikely events occur. And when those unlikely events occur, we turn to reasoning artifacts to help us understand them. And Mr. Scarborough turned to scorn, and I turned to these people on this panel who, in my estimation, are doing the best job of showing, not telling, what's going on the ground in American politics. This panel consists of 4 people. I'd like to introduce them now. Andrei Scheinkman, right here to my left, is from FiveThirtyEight. Then we have Amanda Cox from the Upshot / New York Times, Tim Wallace from the New York Times, and Alicia Parlapiano from the New York Times. And these 2 outlets, as you guys know, are doing a fantastic job pushing the envelope of what political discourse looks like and what it feels like. And it gets better with each election cycle. So I hope that these fine folks come and visit us every year we do this conference. So without further ado, our first remarks are going to be up from Andrei, talking about some projects that FiveThirtyEight built for the 2016 presidential election. So Andrei, on our screen right now we have one of your slides. Can you walk us through what we're looking at?
So for 2016, we built a dashboard where readers could look at and explore the results of our election predictions. And we built a few dozen different visualizations that hopefully gave different angles into the data and tried to communicate this fairly complicated data set of results in a few different ways. So I'm just going to walk through a couple of the graphics that visualized our election predictions and talk about how they came together and which ones I think in retrospect worked and which ones were pretty big failures, I think. So this one is one of my favorites. We had this idea that if we could line up all the states by the projected margin of victory and organize them spatially, we could help readers get a better sense of what are the states that really matter, what are the states that are likely to be the tipping point. And so here you can see a little bit of the process of us trying to explore this idea of putting the states in a particular order and having that update as the election updated. We kind of started with something that was more sort of blocky and square, then we experimented with some designs that were algorithmic but maybe looked a little more natural. Go to the next slide. And here's just a few other steps along the way. We almost published this one all the way on the left until my boss, Nate Silver, referred to it as the intestine chart. And we realized that whoever ended up on the bottom of the intestine chart would be treated unfairly. So, can you do the next slide?
All right.
So we ended up rotating it and turning it from an intestine chart to a snake chart. And this was the final product where you could see the probabilities for each state and the colors, but the ordering is what's interesting here, and what's in the middle each time the forecast updates helps readers understand kind of what's really at play and how close or far each candidate is from getting the number of electoral votes that they need.
So Andrei, looking at this, New Hampshire is squarely in the middle, surrounded by Pennsylvania and Nevada. Can you just tell our audience why New Hampshire's in the middle there? Like, what are we looking at exactly with the ordering of these states?
Yeah, so each state is sized by the number of electoral votes it has, and then we're kind of stacking them up from Trump from the right and Clinton from the left, so that this state in the middle, according to the predictions at the time that the screenshot was taken, suggests that New Hampshire is probably, in some way, the state that matters the most. And that when this screenshot was taken, the prediction says that if Clinton could win everything through Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, they would have enough electoral votes to win the election.
It kind of looks like a tug of war, sort of like you want to pull that rope, right? And as it turns out, that rope got pulled to the right. And I think it's a remarkably sort of efficient graphic, right? But we hadn't seen one of these in 2012, right? Nobody, this is the first year you guys did this?
Yeah, this was a new thing.
Yeah, I hadn't seen anything like it. It's not fancy, right? This is one of the themes that I wanted to come back to with you guys. It's not always the most interactive, splashy graphics that is going to sort of define the discourse or the idea, right? This one performs well on a piece of paper. It performs well without interactivity. But conceptually, it took some sort of new kinds of thinking to get there, right? Not necessarily computational thinking, but new kinds of thinking.
Yeah, the idea in the end is pretty simple, but
Can you talk through just in a short amount of time who at the group sort of and how you guys conceptualize this?
sure. So all these projects we do at FiveThirtyEight are group projects. Aaron Bykoff, who works with me, I think first had the idea of lining up the states and try to figure out who ends up in the middle, and then kind of had a collaborative process of editing it and refining the idea with a lot of people on the staff.
Okay. And then just for the young people here, what software programs and are involved with that? How does this get from that intestinal sketch to the publish button?
Sure, so some of those very early ones, I think we're done with R, but then pretty quickly it moved to using D3. And D3 is our main tool for doing static and interactive graphics at FiveThirtyEight.
All right. Well, we hope to come back to Andrei in a minute, but I'd like to introduce Amanda Cox and her work at this point. Amanda runs the Upshot. Is that fair to say, Amanda?
True on paper.
And, okay, we're good. So she, of course, in true Upshot fashion, gave me a dynamic slide. So we're ready when you are. Is this what we want to start with?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this, to me, just to cue it up, was the defining artifact of the oh shit moment of 2016. The thing that many of us were staring at and staring at and staring at. And kudos for building it, first of all. But I think it really is sort of a monumental moment in internet graphics for our people. So I'd love to hear how you guys approach this project.
Sure. So your laughter suggests many of you are familiar with this work, at least in part. Our goal with this was to just update as fast as we can our assumptions about what were happening. And we've done this several times before. Nate Cohen and several of our colleagues and I did it in 2014. We did it through the primaries. This was the first time that we tried to deal with uncertainty in a formal way. Lots of the examples that we'd done in the past of this sort of live forecasting on election night, we either just showed you, like, here's our best guess, or here's 7 different models, and we would make a couple of them stupid just to, like, sort of cover our butt in case something went wrong. So this is the first night that we'd ever tried to, like, quantify some uncertainty in a real way with the actual number, because people were really attached to that number changing over time. And there are a couple things that we're trying to do with it. We're trying to convey to you that it's live, right? We want you to be a little bit addicted to it. And we want to signal that, we are going to change this all night. It's a form you haven't seen before, unlike you might have expectations that the county map is going to update all night. Like this thing we wanted to say right away that it's going to update all night. We also wanted to suggest that there's some uncertainty in these things, that it's really probability, not prophecy. And so the sort of mechanism that we're using to convey both of those things is we're jittering the needles. We've got 3 gauges up there for win probability, electoral votes, and then just popular vote margin. And people, I think, who are uncomfortable with models are deeply uncomfortable with the jitter. I get Twitter messages all the time now, no matter when we publish anything, that's just like, needs more jitter. And I think, like, yeah, absolutely, the world needs more jitter, right? And so, like, but we're I think it's underknown that the jitter really represents something real. It's wandering up there in between a range, a credible interval, like some uncertainty measurement, and then the bands that you see around there are really are wider. And so if you've been watching, the red and blue bands shrink over the course of the night, and that's exactly what they were supposed to do. And I think the power of being comfortable with a little bit of uncertainty means you can just be so much faster, right? So we were at 95% by 11 o'clock at night. We flipped over to Trump by 9:20, right? And that is just much faster than you can make a race call, right? If you're comfortable with being wrong a little bit of the time, and we weren't on election night, all of those are directionally accurate, but if you're comfortable with the idea that you might be wrong, you can be so much faster than if you're just gonna wait until the very end to make absolutely I'm not gonna take this back, I'm 100% sure that this is gonna happen, nothing could make me change my mind. And so this is just a graphic about how we changed our mind over election night.
Yeah, and I think one of the things it does really well is it's congruent with how the night sort of evolved in a way that nobody had really achieved previous to that in previous elections quite as well. I love that quote, probability not prophecy, right? Because one of the things I took away from election night was that the average American has a hard time understanding what probability even means. If I told you that the Red Sox had an 80% chance of beating the Yankees, and the Yankees won, and be like, oh, well, but in sports it's sort of okay, we get it. It's 28-3, but they have to play the rest of the game for a reason. They play the games for a reason. But yeah, I think this was such a monumental sort of change in how we were doing election night visually, to sort of congruently show that probability is dynamic and evolving too. We have a short panel today. I could talk to Amanda for days about this project. We're going to move over to some of the Times post-election coverage. So this is election night stuff. Tim Wallace, I'm going to pull up Tim's project here in a second. Tim, I'm going to talk about the Two Americas project, if you wouldn't mind telling us about that.
Sure.
What's going on here?
Great. So after the election, after we were all sort of, maybe we're still digesting it, but the day after, we were looking really close. A small group of us were looking really close at how we could possibly explain the areas that were won by Trump that weren't. Areas that were won by Trump and areas that were won by Clinton, and how can we show our readers this division? So I came up with this idea of looking at the county results and looking at the margin that each candidate won by, and interpolating sort of a 0 vote margin line. So you get these sort of circles and little ovals around areas where there was strong support for one of the candidates. And while we were looking at that, the idea there was where are the parts of the country that were evenly split. And then looking at it, it made the country look like two sort of separate geographic areas. So we turned it into this Two Americas piece.
It ends up being a pretty stunning demonstration of how the country is split right now. A century or two ago, the country was split very geographically, very, obviously based on the Mason-Dixon division. Now it's sort of this urban-suburban division that takes a weird shape. Can you talk a little bit about some of the reactions this map got? I know you made
Sure.
InfoWars.
Yeah, that's right.
Timmy
Yeah, so a lot of the reactions were positive from both Republicans and Democrats, because they saw, this is sort of like a cartography thing. People often will see in the map what they want to see in it. But this isn't like a traditional blue-red state map. It's a new kind of imagining of the country, and Trump supporters saw this and they say, yeah, heck yes, we own this country. Look at this, we got all this territory. And Clinton supporters looked at it and said, oh yeah, heck yeah, we have all of the population centers. Look at this. So yeah, it kind of I guess it spoke to both sides.
In the interest of time, my last question, I wish we could talk more about this one too, but the new place names, Santa Fe Sea, Las Vegas Harbor, did you get to create those? I mean, what
I did most of them, but actually some colleagues on the Upshot helped with some of them too on deadline. Yeah,
Modern day Cortez, getting to name all these things.
It was fun. My favorite was the Acela Channel there.
Which one's your favorite?
It's the Acela Channel. Yeah.
Slow moving waters of the Acela Channel.
Right, yeah.
It's fantastic. I wish we'd printed these out so people could look at them in the hall. Maybe we'll get that next year. And so our last panelist is Alicia Parlapiano, also from the New York Times. And which one are we going to start? We'll start here for her. We're ready.
Yeah. So this map was actually, we fast forward a week before the election. It was meant as like a preview to what was going to come. And it ran in print only, and I brought a copy to show you how big it was, over 4 broadsheet pages.
That's a great reaction.
Yeah, so I worked on this with Amanda and with our colleague Larry, and I asked Amanda, what was the genesis of this? I can't remember. She was like, we needed to fill some print space. But it was great because we got to do whatever we wanted in this huge space. And I love print still, and I think it's really cool when we can use it to do things that are it's actually better at than the internet. Something like this, like something so detailed where you can have the annotation right on it, and you can have, down to the zip code level results for the entire country without having to zoom and move and whatever, is really great. And I think that that print kind of showcased this better than the web could have. So here's just some details. So the data was zip code level data, the results from 2012, and Catalyst modeled it for us based on results, the voter file, and their own surveys. And so you get this really great detail. For example, a state like Oklahoma, where every county in the county map was red, you're not going to see a lot of variation in the county map. But when you model it down to the zip code, you say like, oh, even in a really Republican state like Oklahoma, there are little Democratic pockets outside of Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and it provided this like nuance that we hadn't really seen before. And then just showed that slide of Long Island, which was super interesting to us because a lot of the parts of the country it would be like a blue center, and then out from that would be yellow, and then into like the red everywhere. And Long Island had this crazy political striping that showed these like really interesting different communities of all, range of political views. And then there were just some other demographic maps like we used to annotate on the bottom.
So one of the things we were talking about before the panel is you make a map like this and it's great, and it sort of provides this unmatched choose your own adventure for a reader to kind of interact with the political geography of the United States any way they want, and that's great. But as a storyteller, there's a reason novels are more popular than choose your own adventure books, right? We want to direct the attention to things that we've discovered that are particularly noteworthy. And so after you built the large paper map, is it fair to say you decided it was time to sort of write a little directed essay or something about some of the more interesting findings?
There's a common criticism of choropleth maps for the United States, and even at the zip code level. Well, here's an example of a county level map, right? The large area, sparsely populated states are overrepresented, and the places where Democrats live are underrepresented, and so it makes our country look a lot more red and Republican than it really is. And so there's criticism, why did you end up doing a choropleth map? This is really misleading. So I took the time to write down every thought I had about election maps and why. But it was actually a really fun exercise, and just kind of coming to the conclusion that I think most of us don't think there's like one perfect way to do an election map. You have to do a lot of different kinds. There are different forms that are good at different things. Some are really good at accurately representing electoral weight. Some of them are really good at showing where people live. Some are really good at being really accessible and showing you who won the election and who won that state when you need to see it and know immediately. And so our kind of philosophy is just to do all the maps put them side by side, have different, views. And we think that like a sophisticated reader should be able to look at a Corp map and be like, wow, it is really red, but I know that like not a lot of people live there, and so I'm gonna take that redness for what it is and know like, oh, the sparsely populated areas in this country are Republican.
Yeah, and I think the red state, blue state map will always be sort of the alpha dog there.
Yeah, it's
But
iconic.
its explanatory power is limited, whether you're talking about political geography at a higher resolution as your maps show, or whether you're talking about dynamic probability over time. How did this unfold? Those are major things that help us understand elections. As I said, unfortunately, we have a very short panel, but I wanted to open it up. If anybody has any questions, this would be a perfect time. Do we have microphones? Or are we gonna just? Huh? Yeah, but in the meantime, could I get, if anybody has a question, we'll come and find you. But in the meantime, the Times group, could you describe who you are in terms of what your background is, how you all got here, what kinds of people you're hiring? And again, I hate this question too, but what are the dominant software that are allowing people to build these kinds of artifacts? Dr. Tim Wallace, we'll start with you.
Yeah, right. So I'm a geographer, a trained geographer anyway, now a journalist. And to make that map anyway, I used some command line tools, GDAL, for doing raster sort of interpolation, and ArcGIS too, and Illustrator was sort of the workhorse on that, Adobe Illustrator.
And, how many people are at the Upshot now, and are they all sort of coding in D3?
No, not at all. The Upshot's 12 now, I think, by number. And so people who are talented word editors, people who are really not so far different from traditional reporters. And then, the one thing that makes the Upshot unique at the Times is a ratio of people you'd think of as graphics people to more traditional reporters, close to 1-to-1, depending how you count myself. I will forever attach myself to the graphics desk. And so that's very different from most desks at the Times. But.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions for this group? Do we have one question? Yeah. Right here, 3 rows down on the right.
Maybe this is a slightly unfair question, but it's early in the morning, I apologize. Why are these graphics interesting to the people who consume them?
So I'll vote that the one I showed, the election night stunt, showed the thing you care about better than a traditional state map. So I remember like at 11 o'clock on that night, I had a top editor in my office saying, like, we have to explain what's going on here. And I was like, you're showing the same thing on the map on the top of the homepage, right? Like, if it's on you to know that, like, Wisconsin being red right now is a deep problem for the Clinton campaign. And so I think that one is effective because it shows you the thing you actually care about, as opposed to making you presuppose a ton of knowledge and have to infer that.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. And I said that congruent idea earlier, then you said it way better than I did. But at the end of the night, I don't care who wins Nevada. I care who's going to be president, And then the red state, blue state map will always be the sort of central artifact for the Electoral College, and I understand that. But this graphic, I think, did a much better job of being like, Donald Trump's president, and that was the central question of the night, right? I think, why do people, you learn from these things. We have questions that we want answers to. And maps, when it comes to political geography, are the most potent reasoning artifacts we can produce. That's not even really a map. That's sort of a probability map you guys built. But Tim's work, Alicia's work, obviously are more sort of traditional thematic maps that explain the political geography of America in 2016 better than any essay ever could, better than Joe Scarborough ever could. So that's why we're going to see more and more of these as data and analysis sort of continue to grow. And we'll take one more question, then I'll introduce our next panel. Oh, okay, there we go. Last question.
Hi. My name is Ben Miyamoto, and thank you all for being here. I had another question about specifically about the jitter, and sort of what went into that calculation, sort of how frequently the data refreshes, and then maybe just to reflect, or I would ask that you reflect, or all of you reflect on how we might see data representation trend more towards the instantaneous and what that might mean for us as consumers, and then also how you will rethink how you present data in a new way going forward.
Sure. So the actual computation is something called Perlin noise, which is a sort of cool computer science thing that people use to make like fake clouds that look real or fake fire that looks real. And we went that way, and my colleague Gregor Eich because it wanted to feel. I mean, I don't want to say natural because like there's no way that the thing doesn't feel natural, and there are like designers in the world who are like, if this something like this looked like it in real life, I would think it's broken, and like, you know, like that's true of like every map you've ever seen, right? Like the roads would be 70 miles wide, and who knows what, right? But so the jitter is really like you know, shuffling within that interval to say, you know, like, we think it could be any one of these things, right? Like, they're all probably the wrong answer, right? Like, that's the fun part about when you display a number for a game like this. Like, you're very confident that number is actually wrong, right? Like, in this, it's like, you know, the histogram is very wide. And so I think, you know, in my heart, if I were to do it again, I would want the jitter to, like, wander more. You know, people are upset about how much it wandered, but I think, you know, banding it in the 50th, you know, the 25th to 75th interval, like I could go 5 to 95 if I were to ever do it again. But the actual data, the underlying data, we were using the AP feed. So really like every 3 minutes is like when it really changes. And we talked about that in early iterations about what if we just throttled our thing so that like we took 3 minutes to update to the next place, and they were like, that's so stupid. Like, why would, you know, CNN pays like millions of dollars to gain like 3 minutes on the AP feed. Like, why would we like purposely be behind? And so the actual underlying data was you know, the model was running on every update, which is approximately every 3 minutes.
All right, can we give these guys a nice round of applause?